as hard as it is, try and connect with a therapist, and remember, if you don't like them, try somebody else. There absolutely is a therapist out there, and there's a style of therapy that will help.
Take a girl and a guy, and they fall madly in love and form a family. Sprinkle in some counseling degrees and a doctorate, a dream of transforming relationships as we know it. And 20 years later, we give you power couple Dr. Ray and Jean Ketkodian. And this is Couples Synergy.
Welcome back to another episode of Couple Synergy with Dr. Ray and Jean. Hi, I'm Dr. Ray.
And I'm Jean. And this is our podcast about love, marriage, and relationships.
Please check us out online at couplesynergy.com or on Facebook and Instagram at Couple Synergy. And please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review or send us any suggestions on topics you'd like to hear more about. And now on to Couple Synergy, an in-depth look at love, marriage, and relationships, where we bring you our experience helping thousands of couples transform their relationships for over 20 years.
You know, everyone says you should work on your relationship, but nobody teaches us how. So we've created this podcast to teach people what they can do to create the relationship they've always dreamed of
with the partner they fell in love with. On today's episode, we welcome Joelle Maletis. She is a psychotherapist, military psychology, and PTSD expert. She specializes in PTSD, trauma, relationship issues, addictions, and life transitions. Thank you so much for being on our show, Joelle.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to do this and be here and talk to you both.
So we're really interested in the work that you do, and specifically with first responders and military couples. And, before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and, kind of how you got into the field?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and my background and then my dissertation later on was working with broad spectrum eating disorders, trauma, and then PTSD. Was hired by TED to do a TED Ed animation on PTSD, and so that's really where I started work in the field and fell into working with military and law enforcement, first responders, ER nurses. It wasn't what I went to school to do. I'm a ballerina by training. I did that for 22 years and studied eating disorders. So you can draw the dots, right? Like, and then went into working with trauma, I think just because it was my own background, and fell into working with military. And then all of a sudden, I kind of grew up in a military-esque or ish home. My dad did stuff in the 60s, but was not in a uniform and deployed. But I had family members who were in Vietnam, Korea, World War II, and believe it or not, my grandfather had my father really late in life, and so he was a World War I tanker.
Wow.
Who lied about his age, and that's a whole nother story. But so I had this background and it was comfortable to me. And then once I started working with military, all of a sudden it was like, oh, I kind of get my dad. I kind of get this experience. And then they started talking. So, my dad and my family members who were military and had been in some of these big wars started to just have conversations with me. So I was doing this all before military psychology really was a thing that people were studying. And so I was learning as much as I could, as fast as I could, to try and then work with, work with my clients. And then later the clinic became provider for the VA, a provider for TRICARE, TriWest, which is insurance-based programs. And so, and then we branched out and started working with law enforcement and first responders. So that's my story. And I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area in California.
Great.
How would you, what would be a good working definition for the word trauma? It's really thrown around an awful lot in our culture these days. How would you define that?
Yeah, and it is a buzzword for sure. For me personally, I think trauma is in the eyes of the beholder. And so what I see as trauma, it may not affect me personally, but I have a client or people will talk about something that's very traumatic for them, and it holds value to them. It's something that they have experienced firsthand or witnessed. It could be something that it's secondary trauma. They're hearing horrific stories or right now watching the news, and so it's affecting them, I want to say holistically, mind, body, and spirit, right? It impacts the way that they feel and think about things. It impacts how their body's responding, whether they're sleeping, eating. People report having a lot of stress-related symptoms. They feel nauseous, their hands are sweaty, things like that. And then that can be something that people hold on to psychically or spiritually, right? And that can put a wedge in their own, spirituality and faith. So for me, I see trauma as this really invasive experience that people have lived through. And then that's what they're wanting to talk about and how it impacts them.
It's interesting what you were saying, because it almost wasn't the experience, it was the perception. So two people could experience the same event and one person gets a PTSD type of response to it, but the other person might not.
Yeah, I think we need to make a distinction between trauma and PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have different ways that we categorize trauma and traumatic stress. And so post-traumatic stress can be similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. That D disorder is that diagnostic criteria that we use, right? When people come in, it has to meet a certain amount of criteria, 4 weeks or more being present. It doesn't always show up right away. Sometimes it can show up years later. And for me, I look at it as, okay, D, when it affects your daily life and living, right? When it becomes to a point where it's hindering one's ability to function. Post-traumatic stress is something that happens after somebody experiences trauma. And so it can look similarly. However, it's not impacting their daily functioning to a point where they're saying, I'm not functioning well, like I'm not living well, I can't get out of bed, I can't do all of the things I used to do. So, I think for me, those are big distinctions. We have a lot of military and first responders, doctors, right, who say, I have post-traumatic stress, which makes perfect sense. They witnessed something or they're experiencing something traumatic. They have a stress and trauma related response to it. And yet they still function. They go to work every day. It doesn't necessarily impact them, and it may never will. Then we have other people who experience something, who could experience something equally horrific or traumatic, and it impacts them tremendously, and it impacts their daily life and living functionality. So I guess I look at it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed any type of characteristics or anything that a person might have in them that would help them have more resilience in witnessing things that are traumatic?
It's such a great question. As researchers, we don't know a whole lot. We, the field of psychology, we know that people who have early childhood traumatic experiences, people who have early childhood wounding or attachment issues, they may have a narcissistic parent or they've had a lot of emotional abuse. There tends to be a precursor, right? For PTSD, it doesn't mean that somebody will have an issue with PTSD, but there's definitely some kind of correlation, not causation. But beyond that, we don't have a lot of information of why two people, like you said, perception can live through the same thing and one develops PTSD and the other doesn't. And so what we know about resilience is that people who have good mindfulness, joy, joyful, gratitude practices, people who are doing as much for their mental wellness as they are for their physical wellness, and they're developing resiliency skills before trauma, tend to move through trauma quicker. It doesn't mean that they don't end up having PTSD. They tend to be better equipped to move through the PTSD experience with a little bit more ease, I guess is the best way to say it.
That's kind of interesting. I was thinking back to, being in basic training, and you have long periods of time where you can't react to things.
Yeah.
And to me, as now a meditator, I can see what it was doing to my brain back then, of having to self-soothe and, deal with emotions without responding or reacting in any way. And I would say that was probably something that builds some of that resilience. But I wonder if the military is still doing so much of that in their trainings today.
Yeah, I can speak to that just a little bit, not being in working, as a military employee. There definitely is a lot of resiliency training. There's mindfulness training. I think that the military is looking at developing resiliency skills and stress management skills from basic training all the way through advanced officer courses to try and help alleviate some of, I think, some of what you're talking about, right? Where you're being taught a certain way, indoctrinated a certain way, there's a certain way to respond. And so what do you do when you have someone who is emotional by nature and they don't have an outlet? So I think they're looking at it more with military suicide and veteran suicide on the rise again. And right now it's higher than it has been in a long time again. I think we're looking at ways that we can combat trauma and start implementing resiliency training. It's not foolproof.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of your basic training and, kind of how the military and law enforcement has kind of evolved over the years, have you seen like an evolution in PTSD, amongst military folk or also amongst law enforcement?
I think in my experience, what I'm noticing is more people are willing to talk about it. And when we can start to really say, and I teach resiliency training to military and law enforcement. And so part of what I talk about is, why wouldn't you have a traumatic experience? You live through this traumatic thing. Of course, you're going to emotionally, physically, and maybe again, even psychically or spiritually respond, right, to this event. That makes perfect sense, right? Our bodies are designed to respond to trauma, that fight, flight, freeze. That's different than the disordered part, which I think is what the fear and the stigma is about. And so some of it is just psychoeducation. Let's break this apart and explain, here's what's happening in your body when it's under stress and when it's experiencing trauma. And of course, you're going to have this response, right? And then here's some techniques to start implementing resiliency and stress management to see if we can reduce the response to avoid that, de-disordered piece. So I think some of it is there's more willingness to talk about it. There's definitely more willingness to look at officer wellness, military wellness, and implement resiliency and training strategies to combat some of this. And I think it's also people who have been in military roles and law enforcement, first responder roles now for 15 to 20 years are looking at what their friends to the right and left of them are experiencing, some retiring and doing well, some retiring and having committed suicide, not right, and not thriving. And then the younger generation of people that are starting to get into the field and looking at these things and saying, how can we help? And we're willing to finally talk about it. So I think that there's movement on both ends, but it's slow.
You've mentioned spirituality several times.
Yeah.
And I had an interesting thought, when I was a kid, everyone belonged to some form of church, whatever religious practices they did. And today that's much less. As a culture, we don't identify with that so much. Does a person's spiritual beliefs or faith have anything to do with that resilience?
If it matters to the person. And so I think that's the key, is if somebody is saying, I had religious connection or I had spiritual connection before the trauma happened, then it absolutely becomes a necessary resourcing component where we want to try and build that resiliency back up using faith and spirituality, because it was so much a part of who that person was. There are other people that come in and say, that's not who I am at all, in which case that's not necessarily going to help them. Some people find a sense of faith and spirituality after trauma, and other people lose it. And so I think it's an individualized question. I think for me, looking at the person as a whole being, it's important for us to recognize that we have this other component, whatever that looks like for an individual, right? And there's a spectrum of spirituality and religion that people can identify with. So even when people say, I'm not faith-based, I don't have a religion, and I wouldn't define myself as spiritual, but I love to meditate. For me, there's that piece we can cultivate, which I think counts, right? Like, oh, okay, cool. We can bring that in and develop that component that's more than just emotional or cognitive. It's this other layer.
We did an episode with a couple friends of ours who are married, and they're both in law enforcement. They talked about just, being able to understand each other's, daily life and daily experiences. But most often you have couples where one person's a law enforcement officer and you have another person who is in the military, but the other person is not. And so I was just wondering how, in your experience, how's trauma affected marriages and relationships, where one person is experiencing trauma and the other person isn't?
Yeah. I think it sounds like it's such a simple question, and it's so complicated, right? Because, we know, being in this industry, and you working with couples, right, as well, that if you have a good foundation, you have ways to support each other. And when somebody's experiencing trauma, the other spouse can rally, right? And so some of it is that setup or precursor of what's the relationship like before the trauma. I think what happens with law enforcement and military is it becomes dinner table conversation. And so what we see is a lot of partners, spouses, and then children are really accustomed to hearing about that parent or that partner's, right, that spouse's experience on a day-to-day level. And so there's a lot of trauma information. There's a lot of horrific details that are normalized because that's part of being in a law enforcement or military culture, right? And we talk about these things and we talk about them in front of our children. And so, there are positives and negatives about that. A lot of people have different opinions about that. My point only is sometimes we aren't mapping how traumatic it is for our partner, and we're not mapping how traumatic it is for us or for me, right, being the non-military partner, to go through that and hear it all. And so it's I think that sometimes that becomes a wedge. I think a lot of times marriages, especially with people who are marrying younger and their person is just starting their law enforcement or military career, I hear a lot 5 years, 8 years into relationships. Well, I didn't sign up for this. That's always an interesting response for me because, well, of course, it's true that, yes, you knew this person was going to do this field or was in this field. And so in some ways, yes, you signed up for it. I don't think that's what they mean. I think what they're really saying is, I didn't know it was going to be this hard. I didn't know that I would have to watch my partner suffer as much as they do. For some people, it results with, shutting down, anger, drug and alcohol addiction, infidelity, porn. There's all different ways that someone who is not managing trauma well will manifest, right? A lot of times it's anger. And so I think the other person on the other side is struggling with, it's too much for me, and I also don't know how to deal with providing support. I think I answered your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It reminds me of a story of I think it was a client, or I heard it in a training or something, but there was a police officer who on his first night on the job had come across a horrific accident, and it was a family that was killed in this accident. And then having to come home and his wife asking him how was work.
Yeah.
And so I imagine there's two extremes there. There's the extreme of, the person venting and just kind of talking to their partner, letting everything out, even the details. And then the other extreme of keeping it all in because they don't want to burden, their partner with all of those details. Yeah. And, on the other side, you have law enforcement where, the stereotype or the culture, the old culture was just, suck it up and keep it in and, don't really express that. And so there's this internal struggle that most of them have to go through here. And, you mentioned alcoholism and suicide. I mean, all of those statistics are very high, in those fields.
Yeah. I don't think we do a good, we being society, therapists, educators, I don't think we do a good job of giving partners and spouses tools in the beginning of the relationship to say, hey, here's the job that the person you love the most in this world is going to do, and all of the things that comes with that. So let's work on some resiliency techniques for you, or ways that you can be supportive and then also set healthy boundaries, right? We forget about that piece, and so by the time people are coming into therapy, they're really struggling, They
kind of need their own orientation, right?
Right. And I laugh too, because I just think about my own life, and it's like, I do this for a living, and it's one thing to do this professionally, and it's another thing to be involved with somebody who does that job for a living. And I think I'm pretty well trained, and there are moments where I'm looking at my hands and it's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. I can't ask questions because I'm not going to be given any information. So, beyond saying, what can I do for you? How can I support you? What do you need right now? What's my role here? Do you just need to vent? Do you need, should we go out and take a walk? And so it really is arming, I think, partners and spouses with tools to be able to set some healthy boundaries for themselves, and then also staying out of sort of the blast radius, right?
We interviewed someone that was in the Pentagon during 9/11, and he was really a part of it all the way through, helping people get out. And he stayed there at that position for a couple more years after that. And he said, I'm working with people, and we all went through this together. And so it was sort of a normal way of being for them. And then he left the position and he moved to the Chicagoland area. And then he started having symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And, you talked a little bit about sometimes it doesn't show up right away. What are some other things why wouldn't it show up? And so people know that's really a normal experience. It's not instantaneous for everyone.
Yeah. And it's actually more often the case than not. In the beginning, people are doing they're talking, the families are rallying around people. There's a lot of support. And then over time, people feel like they start to stabilize or normalize, and that support doesn't just disappear, but it goes back to what it used to be like. and then something like changing jobs, locations, re-traumatization, other triggers, right? All of a sudden it's back again. So it's more normal and more common to be to come back to these symptoms later on in life than it is when it's happening in the moment, especially with career law enforcement and military. And so, part of it is like you said, I have this sense of I have a team, right? With military and law enforcement, right? I have this team. I have a partner. I have a team. We have a shared experience. We have shared culture. We have a shared language, and they get me. I get them. We don't have to talk about it. And then all of a sudden, now I'm in a completely different either field, area, or phase of life, and I don't have that anymore. And now I'm alone, right? And so sometimes that's the trigger for all of a sudden the PTSD symptoms and then PTSD to really start to present,
As a support person, how would you know if someone is having signs of really being in a position where they may be at risk for suicide?
Yeah, suicide is one of those things that it is more often than not a very quick, spontaneous, and impulsive decision. The myth is if we talk about it, we're actually telling people that it's okay to do it, which is not the case at all. The more we talk about it, the more education we have around it, the better people are equipped to manage their suicidal ideation. So recognizing signs and symptoms is really important. Talking to people, listening to what they're saying. Do they feel hopeless, helpless? They report that they have no motivation, they've lost joy, they have no meaning. So we're listening for buzzwords, and we're listening to, people will say, oh, it's exaggerated, they're exaggerating. And what we're listening for is the velocity and the intensity of how they're reporting it. Do they have a plan? Are they talking about a plan? Do they have access to weapons? Are they giving away possessions? Are they talking more and more about when I'm gone? Sometimes people will say, I just wish I didn't wake up. I just wish I wasn't here. And so trying to figure out as a non-mental health, right, or, non-clinically trained person to say, hey, would it be helpful to talk with somebody? Let's find, how can I help you? Let's find somebody great. Do you want me to go with you? And looking at resources. And it really is talking. It's starting to talk about it. It's very difficult. I have a lot of people that will, that I talk to, or when I do trainings, that will come up to me afterward and they'll say, I did everything. I did all the things, and my loved one still, they still committed suicide. Mm-hmm. And I think the hardest part to understand and to rationalize is it's so impulsive. Is there, more isolation? Are they, not doing the things they used to love? Are they pulling away from family and friends? They don't return texts and phone calls. Are they drinking or using substances more? Do they report they're not sleeping? Sleep is a huge precursor. So when people are saying, I'm sleeping 20 hours or I'm not sleeping at all, that's a good indication. And we're talking about things that are not just one-time events, but you're starting to, see a trend in your loved one. Are they not eating? Things like that.
And I would probably say also expect the resistance. If you are trying to reach out, you're trying to, get them help or trying to get them to talk, that you are going to be met with resistance. And that's probably even more difficult to deal with.
Yeah, it's such a good point, and so how can we gently meet them in a place where really they, a lot of times people will say, I don't want help, right? And I think the other myth is that that it's a very selfish act, and without kind of attacking that necessarily, looking at it from, most of the time people will say, I would be better off, or my family would be better off if I wasn't here. Everybody, and they use hyperbolic terms, everybody, the world, right? You would be better off if I wasn't here, if I just disappeared, if I just went away. And so that's that resistance you're talking about too, right? Is how do you try and convince somebody that no, that's not the case, when they actually believe that their pain and suffering is so great that it is impacting and affecting the world around them, right? In a very negative, dark way.
What would you say to someone who lost a child or a partner to suicide, and they feel that they could have or should have done something different, kind of that survivor's guilt? What would you say to them?
Yeah, the shoulda, woulda, coulda is not helpful. And also the platitudes, I'm sorry, that's so horrible, the toxic positivity, those things are not helpful. And it really comes down to when somebody's sitting with me and that's their experience of saying, and sometimes owning it, even as a therapist, we'll just make up Susie, Susie, I don't know what to say right now, and not but, because we don't want to negate what we just said, right? I don't know what to say right now, and I'm here with you. I want to be here with you, and let's talk about what you need, right? And please, tell me how I can best support you in this moment right now. Because the things that we're trained, I think, as a culture to say are really not helpful. So some of it is starting there very gently and meeting the person where they're at, and then really teaching, CBT, DBT type skills-based techniques to do the thought stopping when I should have, I could have, if only, if I, had only done, if I had just made, okay, stop. Right, take a breath. That's that mindfulness meditation piece you were talking about in the beginning, Jean, right? Of, okay, stop, take a breath, and how is this helpful for you right now? Right. So instead of using shame as a way to deflect the shoulda, woulda, coulda, leaning into the shame, right? How is this helpful? I hear you feel really guilty and you feel really ashamed. Does that resonate? Am I understanding you correctly? Right. And so just very gingerly working with that and having trauma-informed training. If you're a therapist listening, trauma-informed training. So we're not re-traumatizing our clients.
It's amazing how much we need other people.
Yeah.
And when we lock this stuff up in ourselves, that's where it doesn't go so well. And to have other people that are just able to listen and not kind of interject their own stuff into whatever the person's narrative is, and just to be there with them is the most helpful thing we can possibly do.
Yeah, I like the phrase toxic positivity that you brought up there, because it just makes me think of all those Facebook posts that, comments that people say, that because they feel, obligatory, to respond in a certain way. And, just saying, I don't have any words, but I am here for you. That is, and in person, not just, not through text or anything like that, but, I'm just thinking about your cousin and your cousin's son, and, just that point that you're talking about earlier, that it does come in waves, right? It comes, out over time, and it can reemerge, and that's some reassurance there, right?
And this idea of we're supposed to, right? With air quotes, do this a certain way, experience grief a certain way, experience trauma a certain way, experience loss a certain, right? Getting out of that habit, and everybody's going to go through this process uniquely. And so I find myself with with even my friends and people that I know personally, saying, instead of saying I'm sorry, saying, you know, I'm here for you, right? I'm sending you, you know, love, and here's my number. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. I find myself moving in that direction instead of the trained response is, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss.
You know, another trained response that I think is pretty re-traumatizing is when you meet someone that served and you say, thank you for your service.
Right.
And the person's like, you know, and I think that's a really common thing that people who haven't served don't understand, you know, and regardless of someone's experience in the military, there's always, you're still here, regardless of anything else that you had to go through. And people have a hard time feeling good about their service.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting about that because it started, that's a post 9/11 thing that started 22 years ago in response to the negative impact from Vietnam soldiers returning home and how the country dealt with that. Right. So they said, okay, well, we'll just start, you know, thanking people for their service. And then in those early post 9/11 years, the response was, well, thank you for your support. So we were also telling our military members, people are going to thank you for your service. And then you say, thank you for your support. And you're right. Now what we know about it is that's not beneficial or helpful at all. It is absolutely re-traumatizing. And so, you know, again, I think when we're in public and people want to make some kind of connection and show support, and yet, you know, not realizing that, yes, sometimes words from a stranger can be re-traumatizing, can be triggering. And we don't know if somebody, what their experience is. Maybe they had a fantastic time and they're fourth generation and this is their entire life. And that's a lot of pride. And for somebody, you know, maybe they are the only surviving team member that came home, and there's a lot going on for them. And that in and of itself is re-traumatizing.
Well, Joelle, can you tell our listeners kind of where would they find out more information about, you know, what you do and, you know, get in contact with you?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And I love emails and, you know, people can reach out to us and we always respond, especially with resources from all over the country. There's some really great resources that are available. It's my name, Joelle Maletis. I know you will spell it out for in the title, but so it's my name .com. That's the website. So joellemaletis.com. My email is joelle@joellemaletis.com. And you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. And like I said, we put up a lot of material that's psychoeducation that talks about trauma and coping mechanisms, and then providing amazing resources like your practice and what you're doing, and sharing that with as many folks as we can.
Wonderful.
And if somebody was struggling, what would you say to them right now?
As hard as it is, try and connect with a therapist. And remember, if you don't like them, try somebody else. There are so many amazing therapists out there, and there is one for you, right? It may not be me. I'm not for everybody, but there absolutely is a therapist out there. And there's a style of therapy that will help. And call the hotlines. And if that's too scary, there's platforms now that you can chat with a therapist and get help. So lots of different ways to at least try and make a connection if that's something that's doable.
Fantastic. And we're definitely going to put all your connecting info in the show notes and everything. And I want to thank you, Joelle, so much for being on our podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
I want to thank all of you for joining us. And today on Couples Synergy, our passion is in helping couples and people have happy and healthy relationships. And this podcast gives us a fun way of bringing our knowledge and expertise to you, our listeners. For all of you listening, please let us know how much you enjoyed our show. If you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions, please email us at contact@couplesynergy.com. For more information about Couple Synergy and our programs such as Relationship 101, our home study course, the Couples Weekend Intensive, and our premier coaching program called Couple to Couple, look us up online at couplesynergy.com.
And if you know someone who could benefit from this episode, please download it and share it. And thank you for listening.
Until next time, synergize your life and synergize your love.
You have been listening to Couple Synergy with Dr. Ray and Jean Ketkodian. Couple Synergy was recorded, edited, and produced by Dr. Ray and Jean Ketkodian. Voiceover and music entitled Breathe and Let Go was recorded and composed by Gina Gonzalez.